New Hampshire was just famous for H.H. Holmes and the Chameleon Killer? Better think again. New Hampshire is also home to our very own Jack the Ripper. Hey everybody, what's up and welcome back. If you're new here, I'm Liz, your host here at Crimes Untold, and today we're going to be talking about New Hampshire's Jack the Ripper. I stumbled upon this out of nowhere, basically, and I was so excited that I needed to jump on this before anybody else does here in the true crime world, here on YouTube, on TikTok, all of the above. I put a little teaser about it on TikTok. If you don't follow me over there, I'll put it on the screen, or it'll be on the end, like the outro of this video. I'll have it on a, like, at and whatever. You know, you get the gist of it. I'll also put it in the description down below. But, so this Jack the Ripper, his crimes would happen actually a decade prior to the infamous Jack the Ripper that terrorized Whitechapel. You see, there's quite a similarity between H.H. Holmes and this man in particular, which is kind of strange. And we're going to be discussing Franklin Evans, who is actually from Stratford, New Hampshire. Coincidentally, H.H. Holmes, or Herman Webster Mudgett, is actually from Gilmanton, New Hampshire. So not very far from each other, which is kind of interesting if you think about it. So, Franklin Evans was born in 1807 in Stratford, New Hampshire. He didn't have the best upbringing from what I read and what I gathered. Mostly he bounced between family members in different towns such as Concord and Allenstown and Derry, Candia, Salem, and even Manchester. If you're not familiar with New Hampshire, those are various towns that are in a close proximity to one another. And his family was just kind of spread out throughout that area. As we get further into this story, you'll kind of see how he, like, his bouncing around too. And he also would just kind of like roam sporadically as well throughout his childhood, his teenage years, and his early adults, and even his adult years, which we'll kind of talk about. And when he did this, he would roam about Maine and Massachusetts and even into Canada as well. So his reign of terror for his crimes would last between 1850 to 1872. But his final crime he would commit on October 24th of 1872 would be the one that he would commit back in Northwood, New Hampshire, and it would get him caught. So Franklin Evans was married 3 times in his lifetime. His first wife, Mrs. Hannah Peavy, married him in 1832. She was a widow, and they also would go on to have 2 children. But that marriage would end with her death. He would eventually marry 2 more times, but both of these women would leave him. Oftentimes, Franklin Evans is notarized as being a thin-faced man with a slim build and of a medium height. He had dark, piercing eyes, and you could tell that something was off about him, like something was seriously wrong. Oftentimes, this man would reference himself to being a botanic or botanic physician, but really he was just an imposter. So on or around October 30th of 1850, he's living in Salem, New Hampshire, and his second wife had just left him that fall. It is said that in response to his personal turmoil, he decided to strike for the first time. There's also kind of another urge, which I'll add in after I talk about this crime. So he would travel to Derry, which is not far from Salem, not far at all. And he would scour the town for his first victim, just walking around. And his first victim, he would kidnap a 5-year-old daughter of Stephen Mills of Derry. The crime is said to have happened just like this. So he was walking by the house of the Mills family and saw the young girl playing on the floor. He then would climb in through this window, proceed to grab the child after like I just mentioned, he climbed through the window. He would carry her into the surrounding woods where he would proceed to strangle her. His initial intent would be to rape her and mutilate her body, but when he took off her clothes, he noticed that She suffered from a deformity on her spine and of her hip. So after he saw this, he then decided to just bury her underneath a rotten chestnut tree. So later, after he is caught, when he admitted to his crime, he said that he was absolutely repulsed by her deformity and decided not to desecrate her corpse, because his true urge behind this crime was to examine her corpse for surgical purposes. Does that give you like a little reminiscence of H.H. Holmes and all? So due to him saying he's a botanic physician, he would spend quite a lot of time in the woods. With him being in the woods, this also would aid in him finding spots where he could hide his bodies, or hide the bodies of people, of his victims, and hunt for medicinal herbs, which would kind of be like a cover for if he asked somebody that's in the woods, oh, hey, have you seen this? Where is this? If people found him in the woods, it would be an easy way out for him. So in 1853, he's roaming around the woods in Augusta, Maine. This is when 14-year-old Anna Sibley was walking home from school and she passed by him. He then would grab her and bring her into the woods, where he then would proceed to rape her, slit her throat, and hide her underneath a pile of leaves. Then just up and leave like nothing happened. His crimes would subside for approximately about 10 years. So this is when he would take on a whole new persona. He pretended to be an Adventist preacher in 1862, while he was going by the name of the Rev. Franklin Evans. And no, I'm not kidding. He had a serious problem of verbal diarrhea, or the other way to say it is the gift of gab. And so people would oftentimes listen to him. So this was pretty easy for him to preach about whatever is in his brain. So apparently one day in Boston, he was attending an Adventist meeting where he would appeal to people listening to him about sympathy. And he is the least sympathetic person to be listening to. If they only knew at this point. Seriously. So the following day, he would spend a lot of his time with his religious friends, but after something he does, they would not want anything else to do with him. This is due to him taking the tithing money that they had raised and using it to have some fun with local prostitutes. He would be arrested, and due to this arrest, he then would leave Boston and go back to Augusta, Maine to carry on the act of the Rev. So when he was back preaching in Augusta, Maine, he would visit the home of the Libby family, a local Adventist family in the neighboring town of Strong. So one fateful day and one fateful Sunday, 9-year-old Laura Libby was going to church. She left home and walking to church, but she never made it there. So the following day, this is when the people of Strong would gather together to search for Laura, and later on that day they would find her. So her remains were found on the property of the Libby family farmhouse in a shallow grave. Her remains were naked and she was mutilated, unfortunately. Her throat had been cut to the point of nearly being decapitated, and she had been raped. So there was an Irish farmhand on the property. His name is Lawrence Doyle. He was thought to have committed this crime, but in the long run, he actually didn't. So he was tried and he was convicted of her murder, and he would die after being in jail for 6 years. He maintained his innocence the entire time he was in jail. And I'm pretty sure that after Franklin Evans was taken into custody, they did something to rectify the situation with Lawrence Doyle, but don't hold me accountable to that. So 3 years after the murder of Laura Libby, this brings us to the end of the Civil War in 1865. So Evans was back at it in Boston, him being the Rev, him hanging out, yada, yada, yada. So veterans of the war were coming home and they were on the road without any jobs. And oftentimes they looked like a bum. And Evans fit right in with this. He was tall, he had long gray hair and a big old beard, so he fit in with the other people that were walking around, so nobody would think twice about it, unfortunately. But he was also back to his Adventist preaching ways as well. And while he was in Boston delivering lectures, 2 children were found murdered. So their remains were found in Boosey's Woods, which is now called the Arnold Arboretum in Roxbury. So these were 14-year-old Isabella Joyce. She was stabbed 27 times in the torso and 16 times in the neck. And due to defensive wounds, they could tell that she put up a fight, and her index finger was severed, and they believe this happened during the struggle. And she also had clumps of grass in her mouth, which they thought the killer shoved in her mouth to quiet her. She would be raped and she would die due to her wounds. Well, the second victim in this is her brother, 11-year-old John Joyce, who watched in terror as his sister was attacked. It is thought that he was trying to flee when he tripped over a root, and then the killer stabbed him 6 times in the back. Now, John was so small that the knife had gone completely through his body. Completely through. All 6 times. So, around the same time of this murder happened, a woman had seen a tramp-like man in the woods, and he asked her if she knew where any evergreen was. Strange, right? Evans frequented the woods. That's actually how we know exactly what happened to these 2, Isabella and John, is because of his confession later on. So this woman, after he asked her this question, she would go on to scream at the top of her lungs, and she ran away from him. So this man was haggard in appearance, and he had long hair. The community would come together to try and find this killer or suspected killers. And while they were searching for this man, they wouldn't know that Evans had actually returned to New Hampshire, but they would find another set of remains. So this skeletal set of remains was of a man, and it was found 12 miles away in Needham. Police assumed that this set of remains was actually the killer due to the hair being found on the body that was similar to that of the tramp. But if that was the killer, how is it already skeletal remains? Right? They did things so strange back then. So, like I mentioned, after he's caught, after Evans is caught, the sheriff that catches him would put 2 and 2 together that he was actually responsible for the Joyce murders. And it is said that the woman that actually screamed, in her reaction to this tramp talking to her, she actually identified Evans via pictures that they had, or 10 pictures at the time. And she was like in shock and in absolute terror when she saw his picture. So by the time of 1870, this is when Franklin Evans is actually living with his brother, Elias Evans, back in Derry, New Hampshire. So Evans took out an insurance policy on himself in the amount of $1,500 for accidental insurance. Now, this insurance is just for that month, which is very odd. And he stated that this insurance was for his trip to Canada and listed Elias as a beneficiary. And apparently that, like I mentioned, this is a month-long insurance, that this trip was going to be a month long, and then he just kind of up and left. So Franklin would go to Hampton, New Hampshire, and check into the Hotel Whittier and Annex, and he planned to swim on the beach. But he wouldn't be there for a while. Oh no. He left his clothes with papers in the pocket of his pants on the beach, and on the papers it had his name so police could see that it was his items. So the basis of this is to assume that he drowned. Elias was called about his missing brother, and then he went to Hampton to look for him and help establish his death. And the insurance adjuster that were basically given this case thought that this was suspicious and denied the claim. So Franklin was actually up in northern Vermont at a barn that his brother owned, which I find very ironic. So in 1872, there would be another body found in Fitchburg, Mass., and Evans admitted to killing her as well. Shortly after this body being found, this is when he would move in with his sister in Northwood, New Hampshire. So his sister lived, obviously, with her husband, her widowed daughter, and her granddaughter, Georgiana Lovering, who was 13 at the time. So Franklin paid for his room and board, and he worked at a nearby farm. And he had a wandering eye. Not for anybody other than, technically, it would be his grandniece, Georgiana Lovering. Oh yeah, he was watching her. So on October 24th of 1872, Franklin asked Georgiana to come help him to check his snares on the 25th. So that morning on the 25th, Georgiana gave her mother a kiss goodbye and went out to help Franklin. But later that evening, Georgiana never returned. This would be alarming for the family, and the community would also help look for her. 4 days would go by after she disappeared, and they kept looking for her, but they couldn't find her. The local sheriff, Henry Drew, had initially suspected Franklin Evans due to him not being at work the day that Georgiana disappeared. And when he was questioned, he said that a guy named Webster had taken her to Kingston. But the sheriff didn't buy it. He would send people to search Kingston, but they found nothing. And Sheriff Drew still didn't believe him. So some good old-fashioned police work would happen, and I say that with the utmost amount of sarcasm. Drew would bring him to his home and ply him with alcohol, and he would badger him until he confessed, until the truth came out. Evans would admit that she was dead and he did wrong. So what does Drew do? He basically told him, "You show me where the body is and I'll help you escape to Canada." So Franklin believed him. So the middle of that night, they went to the woods where Franklin said she was, and Sheriff Drew had people follow them, tail them, on purpose. So while he's following Franklin, they walk towards a swamp. Evans would bring them to a hollow in which is covered by rubbish and some stones. This is when he points and says, "There." Drew first is like, "What?" And he repeats himself, "There." So Drew takes this as, oh, this is where her body is. So he lowers himself down and moves some of the leaves and scraps, and he sees this white object. He put his hand down on it and then realized, oh, fuck, this is the body of Georgiana. Man, he immediately put Evans in shackles. So Evans would formally confess to lying in wait for Georgiana, strangling her manually, then raping her after she died. So necrophilia. Yummy. He then proceeded to cut out her reproductive and sexual organs so he could study her anatomy. What a nice great-uncle, great-granduncle. So his trial began on February 3rd of 1873, and on day 2 of his trial, February 4th, he tried to kill himself with his suspenders. It's original, I'll give him that. He would plead guilty due to reason of insanity, but that wouldn't hold. He was found guilty after half an hour of deliberation on day 3. So he would be sentenced to death by hanging after being in jail for a year. It is New Hampshire law for people that are on death row. They have to be in jail for at least a year prior to carrying out their death sentence. I did double check this. It is absolutely correct. Yes. While he was in jail, he admitted to his other crimes, and he also played a part of being a pious preacher, like he did during his normal life, before he was caught. And he's a lying sack of shit. Yay. So prior to his death on February 17th, 1874, he signed a confession admitting to only the death of the Mills child and to Georgiana. But we know that's not true. He had ultimately confessed to the other murders as well. So the day of his hanging, he wore a black suit, and at 11:06 a.m., the sheriff put a black hood on his head. The sheriff pressed the drop spring, and the trapdoor was released. It took 20 minutes for his heart to stop. He slowly strangled to death, because normally when a person drops with the noose around their neck, they'll die instantaneously from a broken neck. That is not what happened. His neck did not break. He slowly strangled himself to death. he would be cut down, and then his body would go to its final resting place, which when I read this, I laughed. So Dartmouth Medical College, where students could dissect his body like he did to the small children that he unfortunately killed. That is his final resting place. So that, my friends, is New Hampshire's Jack the Ripper. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I will see you guys in my next video.